So, and now that we are recording, let me just say it's a matter of reinitiating the process that today we're going to be talking about the phenomenon of cultural appropriation, its relationship to other processes such as cultural assimilation. And we don't want to be detained at the level of abstraction. We're going to try and come into the interrogation of concrete examples. And the initial example, which we've taken up here as per the cue of Daniel, and then quite adeptly taken up by Luke, is how someone like Elvis Presley can draw on a tradition which emerges predominantly from African Americans in the early 20th century. Not exclusively, there's more than one tributary flowing into what becomes his production. Whether that's an instance of cultural appropriation, and then Luke here has just noted how complicated the matter becomes, in that artists can see themselves as part of a natural progression where they're drawing on others in the sort of course of a historical conversation in a way which doesn't enter into the same problems of power which occur in other quarters. However, as soon as that music then becomes part of a machine of commercial production or cultural production, the complexion of what's occurring definitely alters its character. So much by way of recapping our initial remarks. Would you say that was a fair review there?
Yes. And would you mind, I just came in on it right before you, I clicked in, restating your working definition for cultural appropriation?
So, what I would say is that cultural appropriation is where a particular cultural group will take an element from another cultural group and lift it more or less in a wholesale fashion out of its original context and employ it for some end which is more or less their own. And this becomes problematic in that by extricating that element from the original culture and the original context, a kind of violence is being done to that original culture and context. Sometimes it's sufficiently slight or innocuous that we can leave it go, but where it really gets dodgy is in situations such as where you have an imperial or a dominant culture employing the process of cultural appropriation as a part of a negation of the subordinate or the oppressed culture. So you can look at in America, you can look at the treatment of Native Americans and how this sort of almost kitschy employment of elements from their history actually serves to negate their intrinsic dignity. Another point which arose in the course of the conversation last week, which is how it relates to the process of cultural assimilation. When you want to resist a scenario of oppression, whether you're Native American, whether you're Irish in the 19th century, you don't want to just kowtow to what's going on with the English, whether you're black in North America today or what have you. You don't want to just define yourself oppositionally. You don't want your ethnic identity or your cultural identity to be simply a function of opposition to the dominant culture or system. But in order to do that, you need a sort of positive resource, and that first order positive resource is the culture which is being oppressed. So in the Native American case, or the primary or First Peoples case, you don't want elements of that culture, which is the resource of identity that isn't dependent on the fact that you happen to be oppressed, assumed by the oppressing culture, and then used in a fashion which bastardizes or negates the original dignity, depending on what the element in question is. So does that go to your query, Luke?
Yes.
And the hope here is to try and not just be on Bum, 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 bum. Not just be on an abstract level, but come up with some concrete working examples. We've already sort of looked at a first plus fashion at like Elvis and rock and roll and the relationship of rock and roll to prior folk and cultural forms. And the question is is what's going on there cultural appropriation? The answer is, well, it seems that it isn't really cultural appropriation until there is an involvement of production. And, I was thinking about the phrase cultural appropriation and how you say, well, that means that the culture is being appropriated. So what is appropriating? Can a culture appropriate another culture, or would it be more accurate to say that there's a system in place or a set of systems in place which are appropriating the culture and thereby actually negating that culture as a positive human phenomenon? What do you guys think?
Well, go ahead.
And actually, I've just got a question here by Fun Escape Cast. Who is really offended by cultural appropriation? So we will address that question momentarily. I just happened to finish one, so let Luke and Dan go ahead and tackle that, and then we will turn to your question there, Fun Escape Cast, in just a second. So, or if you guys just want to take that question, that's fine with me too. Whatever. So,
Luke, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think that there's a difference, much like in, say, language, how language evolves and adapts over time. And I know it's kind of referencing what I said about music earlier, but if you have two populations that are completely segregated from one another, and then all of a sudden you have some, again, a trade route, or it could even be a war, it could be anything, where these two peoples who have very different languages are exposed to one another, there are going to be certain distinctions that remain in the language, and there's going to be kind of a middle ground, like what we would call Spanglish, or where it starts to kind of meld. And if you get enough infusion and overlap and you give it long enough, those two kind of assimilate and absorb over a very long period of time to where there's less and less distinction. I think if culture happens like that, naturally, for example, let's say, I work on a particular merchant ship and I'm from one nation, and you work on a merchant ship and you're from another nation, and we become friends. And I share my type of cuisine with you, and how I tell you about my people and how our families are, and this, that, and the other, and you do the same, and we become friends, and it's an organic assimilation of one another's culture. I think that's very different than if you go up a level from individuals or communities, and you start creating systems, corporations, whatever, who just rip off somebody else's culture, music, art, whatever, and just turn it into a product. Just boom. You have something that's valuable, that's different. Now let's make it like retrofit it into our particular system to make money off of it, or to empower ourselves over you, and then forget about you when it happens.
So we're drawing a distinction between the sharing of one's culture, the incidental overlapping of one's culture, let's say vis-a-vis Caribbean, Cuban, African, and French cuisines all found in, let's say, Louisiana. The organic kind of mixing, overlapping that occurred there. And so there's a distinction then between sharing voluntarily in appreciation of differences, and then there's this cultural overlapping that happens because of people in place, and over time these things kind of just happen. And there's a difference then between that and appropriating, taking. And I think that might be something that we need to discuss and explore more deeply, because that was probably part of my difficulty. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is there's a hell of a difference between sharing, cultural overlap, and then taking.
Yes, I think that is
maybe it would be different, right. Daniel, if for example you knew that I needed to borrow $5 and you loaned it to me, versus I went in your wallet and I stole $5 from you.
Yeah, I get it. I'm just trying to verbalize what we've. What's going on.
Yeah, I mean, an example, which is a sort of an older example, and I think that we're actually sort of feeding in. Hello, Kristen, by the way, to Fun Escape Cast. He is so a few things here. He asked us, he or she, I'm sorry, I don't know which, asked. First of all, are people actually offended by cultural appropriation? Are we artistically limited due to our culture? And then and invited us to, thank you, Mark, move away from a merely theoretical gesture. Oh, well, maybe Kristen will come right back. So, I mean, I personally am aware of people who are sensitive, and I am, in fact, sensitive to issues of cultural appropriation, precisely in virtue of the distinction which Daniel just made, where elements of a culture are sort of taken and then used in a way which is at odds with that culture. So a historical example, which was pointed out to me earlier today, which might be useful, even though it's a bit dated, has to do with the Cathars and the relationship with Catholicism. The Cathar heresy, kind of a paradoxical one, in that it was associated with things like troubadourism and a sort of more vivacious celebration of the musical and the artistic and so forth. But also rendered. I'm about to give an example, Mark. Sexuality in a rather dim light. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church at the time felt, and the broader culture felt a kind of threat at this different account. And the result was an intense and violent repression of the Cathars, and leading really to their effective extermination. But in the wake of that process, the Catholic Church then took over elements that were specifically Cathar, of a sort of a musical dimension and a greater celebration of the feminine. And this fed into the usage of the Virgin, the concept of the Virgin, and the role of the Virgin in the sort of mythological view of Catholicism. Not that was without precedent, but what happens is, well, what are you? How do you feel about that as a Cathar? Well, you're not necessarily going to be happy about that, are you? Right? And it's not like there was like a little footnote when the Catholics used those elements subsequently. Oh, by the way, we got that from the Cathars. No, they wiped them out and then used elements of what they were doing to further their own success. So that's obviously a sort of more dated example. So a personal example for me might be it's complicated because it involves not just simply cultural appropriation, but other things as well. But we don't have to be too academic about it. Was you can look at St. Patrick's Day in an American context, okay, where you have the idea that it's a celebration of Ireland, and in part in an Irish culture in an American context, and in part it is, but then it's admixed with this assertion of really grotesque stereotypes about the Irish. Oh, well, they're drunks and boorish, and they're not particularly sophisticated, and they just want to have a bacchanal or what have you, and which just get all hammered and forget about what's seriously going on in the world. Well, guess what? That's not the sum total of what it means to be of Irish descent. And it doesn't in any meaningful way acknowledge the fact that the Irish were grotesquely oppressed and are still indirectly, in a way, oppressed by the English and Western culture more generally. But that's all sort of swept under the rug, okay, where items from, Irish iconography and Irish culture are assumed to actually formulate this alternative picture of what it is to be Irish, right? So that's a personal example, since I happen to be of Irish descent. I don't know if the other guys also have examples. I'll turn it over to you.
What is enable? Okay. Enable? What it, I didn't see it. What does that mean? I couldn't find a definition for it.
What's this?
Benevolent?
I don't see
I think
it. Sorry.
He means
Enslaved. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Oh.
Clears up the
over in
whole
the sidebar at the top.
Oh, okay. I see now.
I don't claim to know everything, so I'm
right.
fully accepting that there are things that I don't know. So thank you for making that clear.
By the way, there's nothing wrong with being able to laugh at yourself. The problem is that when you look at the holiday in the American context of St. Patrick's Day more generally, it's a conflation of elements which are positive in themselves, including the ability to laugh at yourself, with the celebration of a stereotype, which demeans the Irish, and which also, again, I would argue, broadly sweeps the reality of their history under the table. And in this way, I don't agree. I don't think people are actually trying to be offended. Okay, and you can look at I think the Native American case is a very you keep throwing all these questions out, and I can't give them like simple one-word answers. Okay, right. The Native American case, I think, is an interesting and sort of illustrative one. Okay, where you have elements like the sweat lodge, for example, which is appropriated to feed into a particular conception of spirituality, and and so people think that then people can be like very irresponsible in their application of that particular ritual, and in virtue of their irresponsibility, people don't necessarily understand the whole tapestry out of which it emerges. And I believe the Lakota have done some work on this specific issue. But let me take a moment and turn it over to Luke or Dan or Kristen. What do you? I mean, I've been talking for a while here.
You're doing a great job.
Well, you're thank you, Chris. But why don't you guys see what are some examples?
It may this may seem I know that from some of the comments, at least one's hoping we steer away from abstraction, but this unfortunately is kind of an abstract.
Yeah.
I think the degree to which a people is disenfranchised, the strength of it, the length of it, it exacerbates offensive reaction to stereotypes. This is a goofy example. Let's say I was walking across the street because it's snowy and I slipped in the snow, just gingerly busted my ass, and my neighbor was like, oh, he just kind of chuckled at me, but we have a good relationship. I probably wouldn't be upset that he kind of joked with me about falling down. Let's say I was crossing the street, a drunk driver hit me with a truck and paralyzed me, and he saw me and pointed at me and laughed. The degree to which I was hurt, whether it was just something that happened or I was victimized, and the degree of the victimization, it makes the joking about it more raw of a nerve, at least for me. Maybe not for somebody else, but it would be for me. So I think that when we stereotype a people, and to his point, I mean, sure, you can joke around, oh, Irish people like whiskey, whatever. I like whiskey, but tonight I'm drinking rum, and I'm Irish. So nonetheless, if you were to joke around with a Native American person about the Trail of Tears, you know what I'm saying? I don't think that it would be the most humorous thing that ever happened. Versus, you joke around with me about having a cold, I'm not going to be as upset about you joking about my sniffly nose as my ancestors being given disease-ridden blankets to kill them in a genocidal fashion. I think degrees in nuance, it does matter to in this discussion, at least in my experience. But what are your thoughts on that?
I'm sorry. I really want to hear from Kristen, but I when we discuss these ideas about appropriating cultures and things like that, and particularly when we're talking about things like Native Americans or the Black community in the United States. And this isn't something that is this isn't an idea that's just lofty in the blue by and by. It doesn't just float out there in the ether. These are things. These are forces that are actually at work in cultures, in communities, and in people's lives. And so it's fine to say, oh, well, people are just being oversensitive. But what we have to understand is these things that we're discussing have been used to absolutely dehumanize entire cultures, entire peoples, to paint them as a gross caricature in the case of the Irish, or even in the case of the Native Americans, the first peoples. These things are really harmful, and it's not just a case of being oversensitive. What it amounts to is a group of people. Maybe it's a case of America or this generation has just grown up enough to be honest about ourselves and to be reflective about what's happening. Now, there are people who've been way ahead of the game, who've been doing this for a long time, but now that these kinds of conversations are out in the open and they're out in front of us now, it might well be that we've grown up a little bit and we've become a little more civilized. And it's time we had conversations like this. And these conversations aren't frivolous, and they're not unworthy of discussion. They're very important, particularly to the people who are being harmed by the things that we're discussing. And so to say, well, I joke about Black Lives Matter with a friend who happens to be Black, well, that means nothing to me. It's meaningless.
I mean, the thing is that we don't know the broader context of that humor, and how you're joking about it, and it's very complicated, and because what does it mean for that matter to? Well, it's complicated, right? Keep saying that phrase, but it seems inevitable in this connection. I have like two other examples, but before let me turn it over to you, Kristen, because we've been gabbing for a bit.
Oh no, you're fine.
What are your thoughts?
I'm just enjoying the side comments in relation to what you guys are saying, and there's some humor, here, of course. But I don't believe that white American culture can be appropriated, because we are, and I put it in the comments, that we are an amalgamation of several different cultures. What do you think?
Well, it depends on what. Go ahead, Luke.
Well, I would just say, for example, you might be able to regionalize it. For example, you could say, well, in my state of Indiana, which I don't care about basketball or pro sports at all, but it would be a stereotype of Hoosiers that we're all about Indiana, or we're all about, basketball and college basketball, and that's all people from here care about. Well, if you were from another state, you could joke about that stereotype. Now, that wouldn't offend me if someone painted me with a brush of, you're from Indiana, so you have to be into college sports. But I also haven't been subjugated or anything because of it.
Though. Sorry to
that's what you could say. You could say anything that you wanted. You could say it's your average white population in Indiana. You could say it's black population. I'm not saying that the analogy would work. I'm just saying you could try to make it a thing, but it probably wouldn't work. To your point, Kristen, the Caucasian population in America is not as distinct in our culture as, say, other countries where Caucasians are indigenous to.
I think that to some degree, we actually, as a nation, pride ourselves in being multicultural.
I mean, that's an ideal that is offered up. Now, whether we succeed in the realization of that ideal is another matter. We can even actually look at maybe that ideal itself is perhaps problematic in its contour. I did want to answer Timothy's question. If your minority group actually prospers in this society, does any of this matter? And my answer there would be yes, because the background of what I would argue, Tim, is that cultural appropriation generally fails to respect the autonomy of the root culture from which the element that is being appropriated is taken. So you can, and and a lot of times you can't have a chemically pure example, if you like. But I remember, this is just to sort of keep it at the anecdotal level. This is about a year ago. I was actually in a coffee shop, and there was a band of high schoolers who came from a very privileged. They were white, and they came from a very, very privileged community, and they elected, which is their prerogative, to play a set of classical blues numbers, that came out of the bio and so forth. And even though removed from the root culture that produced that music, I was highly uncomfortable with that performance. I almost felt like I didn't go in there expecting to feel this way, but I was spontaneously sort of almost offended at these incredibly privileged people assuming a musical form that had risen up in response to grotesque oppression as a way to sort of celebrate the human vitality in the face of that oppression. And so, even if I happened to be a successful African American, I think I would still take umbrage at the manner in which certain often well-moneyed people will take artifacts of my history and heritage and use them in a cavalier fashion as a negation of the concrete history from which we have all emerged. Likewise, you can be a wealthy Native American, you can be a successful, I'm just trying to think of other sort of obviously oppressed groups, a successful Latino, for example, right? And you can look at how elements of Latino culture can be appropriated in a way which, again, fails to respect the history of the oppressed culture in question. See, that's really the problem, is that the cultural appropriation. All right. So you can look at yoga. That's a good example there, Susan. And I have my thoughts on it, but I've been doing an awful lot of talking. I don't want to be. I feel like I'm dominating the conversation. So let me throw out the two other examples of which I thought, and I'm going to try and restrain myself and just let everybody else talk for a minute. The two other examples of which I thought were Charlie Hebdo, or just the sort of caricature of Muhammad that political cartoonists, not just Charlie Hebdo, but around the world have enacted, and how this has elicited an offended response from, and I'm not even just talking about people who do terrible things, okay? Because that, but you can look at how Islam and people of Islamic faith are the elements of their sacred faith are mocked and used derisively by a culture that is both sort of extracting from their land vis-a-vis fossil fuel plundering, and is bombing their countries and killing their women and children. That's an example of cultural appropriation, where the figure of Muhammad is being used in a derisive fashion, right? I think I can see why someone might be offended at that. And I had another example, but it eludes me. So let me just turn it over to you guys. I'm actually going to mute myself. I just listen for a minute and let you guys throw in. Well, Tim, I'll try and respond to you again in a moment, but let me turn it over to the other people because I've been talking. So.
Okay, so we have some people joining us a little bit, after we started, and it may be helpful to just have a little bit of a reminder about the definition of cultural appropriation. I think it's very important to do so because As Samuel said, essentially Chinese people using genes as cultural appropriation. And I would argue that would probably fall more into the category of cultural exchange, because no one is being, like, there's not a higher power or a more a greater power being harmed. Like there isn't it's not, I'm not saying that right. There's not a weaker power being harmed when the Chinese are using, whatever, Bebe or whatever it is on their genes. And that is pretty much the defining difference. Am I right? We can all pretty much agree about that.
Yeah, it's a power relationship, I think, that draws the distinction.
Mm-hmm.
An interesting thing on the genes is when genes were introduced, obviously Levi Strauss and Company, they were heavily marketed to the railroads and to railroad workers because of their durability, which disenfranchised and oppressed Chinese people who worked on the railroad. So Chinese people here got genes about the same time that Caucasians here got genes. So I don't really see. So I agree with what you're saying, Kristen. But once knowing the history of genes in America, mm-hmm. Ironically, Chinese folks in America got genes the same time that white people in America got genes, for the most part. That's more of an answer to Chinese people using genes. They got them at the same time we did. They just happened to be here. So.
Thank you. Interesting. Oh, there's so many good questions in here. And I think that's just a testament to the need to have this sort of discussion and conversation. I think that we're all, like, with the growing accessibility to each other in different parts of the world, we're kind of in this flux where we're trying to understand, how do we communicate and how can we do so in a productive way so that we can all, arrive together. So I really appreciate, Thomas, I appreciate you initiating this.
Well, I don't know if I can take the credit there because you held the first one a few weeks ago on this issue. So, but thank you, Kristen. So, why don't you, Daniel? You've been quiet for a minute. Why don't you? Do you have anything to add at this junction?
Yeah, I think that for some of the questions I've read here on the sidebar, I'd just like to go back to the distinction we made earlier, that there might be a difference worth exploring between the sharing of cultures, two individuals or two groups, or even two friendly nations that might exchange some kind of cultural dialogue, versus where you have a group, let's say geographically, a group, people from different areas who settle in the same area for whatever reason, and then their culinary cultures, their musical cultures, and so on begin to just naturally overlap just because of the vicinity in which they all live. And so you get wonderful foods like Cajun, and you get Zydeco music and all of these things, versus a taking for use, for some other use other than just being a culture. I think that was a distinction we made earlier, and I think that we might be getting a little bit away in some of these questions from understanding that cultural appropriation in the way that I understand this direction of this conversation is used as a tool of imperial power and to remove people of their own power culturally. Mm-hmm. To take their cultural individuality away from them, thereby making them either non-people or forcing them into a kind of faceless, cultureless group that's easier than to manipulate or assimilate altogether.
Another way we might look at it, perhaps, which could be helpful, is that there's a category of the exotic, okay, where you're like, ooh, we're gonna go have ethnic cuisine, right? You know, we're gonna go out, you know, have this particular kind of food from this particular restaurant, and that's like, oh, it's Indian, or oh, it's Chinese, or you know, oh, it's Ethiopian. You know, what's going on there with the sort of branding and celebration of that cuisine, and is that it's there's apparel that what you're doing is you're creating the other, like, oh, they're from, you know, the other part of the world and they're very different and so forth. And depending on how that happens, you can hopefully see potentially it could relate to how that culture or those people could be subsequently dehumanized by being treated as a kind of cartoon of who or what they originally are. A sort of tongue-in-cheek way that you can sort of elucidate this might be how there's like a joke. They're like, okay, what do they call Chinese food in China? They call it food. Okay, right. So what happens is that when you, I guess the maybe the fancy pants word is reify a culture outside of your own, then you're by bracketing them in that way, you're creating a space for their objectification. And once they're objectified, then you can just take them apart piecemeal and take elements of their culture apart piecemeal, and in this way no longer respect the boundaries which one might say are necessary for just sort of sound human interaction. Now, again, I think that the distinction is crucial between sharing and appropriating, right? Because we're not saying that we can't, you know, use or employ elements of each other's culture, but we have to be very careful about how that happens. Because if we're not disciplined, what transpires subsequently is that you can do real damage to the original culture. And so the idea of yoga came up along the sidebar, right? You know,
and that's often a classic example of cultural appropriation.
Part of a very rich spirituality, a rich tradition. Okay, and it's a mixed tradition. It's not all rainbows and roses, you know, and unicorns, okay, because it can be connected with other sort of darker things like the caste system and so forth, right? But what happens in America is it just becomes a form of exercise, you know, kind of fitness, and then becomes divorced from the original spirituality and the discipline and ethical commitments which are involved with that spirituality. It also allows a particular idea of what it is to be from India, and which serve, again, as a cartoon, or which suppresses or minimizes the incredible complexity of Indian culture, right? And where is the damage in that? Well, the damage is that the you know, you can do yoga just for, you know, the physical benefits, but when you extricate it from the original spiritual context, you lose touch with the culture that is giving you the gift of this process. And I think that kind of indifference is problematic in itself. So that would, you know. By the way, there's lots of comments coming along in the sidebar, and I can't keep up with them, I think, as well.
Right.
Some co-hosts here. So let me turn it back over to you guys. What are your guys' thoughts?
I just want to say real quickly that if someone would like to jump in, I'm so happy to rotate out so they can do so.
Just one little point I noticed. There are so many questions going by quickly. It's hard to keep up. But I think in case there's a perception from some of the questioners, commenters, that the four of us have a pretense of we've got this entire thing figured out and we have all the answers. We're having a discussion. We're trying to flesh this out. That's what the conversation's about. It's not like we're hyper reactive, pissed off people banging down our neighbors' doors over pajamas or whatever. We're kind of like, you know, I don't think we can right the pajama wrongs of several hundred years ago. Not that it's ridiculous to talk about them, but
right. Thank you, Luke. We're
not overly charged as far as like everything's racist or something. So I hope it's not reading that way.
It's not too far fetched, I think, to say the pajama rules, as silly as it may seem, because I was married. I was sealed in the LDS temple, and people talk about our funny underwear all the time. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that is taboo, I think, in this discussion, because we're trying to figure it out. And that's why we're here, is because we're trying to figure it out. So thank you, everyone, for being here and figuring out with us.
I don't think it's unfair or unwise to, however, and with respect to Luke's comment, to keep in mind that people are being harmed by this. And that's not to say that I'm not guilty of wearing pajamas myself. I have a couple of pair of pajamas that I love very much. As a matter of fact, I have a Korean gi when I used to take Taekwondo. I'm sure I have some. I'm wearing I'm wearing a shirt right now that from an Irish pub that I used to work at that celebrates St. Patrick's Day. So I'm sitting in a culture that has appropriated items and traditions and practices from many, many different cultures. And just as I work and live in a capitalist society, that doesn't necessarily mean I agree with all things capitalist. So because we happen to engage in with the wearing of pajamas doesn't mean that we are that we're insensitive to the fact that these things are occurring and these things need to be discussed.
What were you going to say, Kristen?
This is we have a question to please explain the pajamas. There's a comment from someone over here.
Now, that was originated in the sidebar. I don't know much about it myself. I think it was, the fact that, the pajamas, I thought it was a word from Hindi, I think. What you're looking at is a particular garment or garment form, which is taken over by the British, who are, obviously at that time were imperially related to India. And, we just sort of don't think about the history whereby we happened to start wearing pajamas at night. And it's just sort of something that we do. And it's the amnesia, I think, which is the real problem there. Okay, it's not that we wear pajamas or that wearing pajamas or using that word is intrinsically disrespectful. It's that there are all sorts of things like that, which we just sort of matter of factly participate without necessarily appreciating the context and how elements of that context can, in fact, be quite damning. Right, so. That's, I think, why the pajama question is an interesting one, right? Or the yoga question is an interesting one. So I think that's what's going on there. So let's see what else. Well, Sam says, well, so you can use parts of other cultures as long as I remember its original purpose and respect it. Is that it? Well, it's something in that vicinity, right? I think it might be helpful to sort of bring the issue of capitalism or monetization or commodification into the discussion, because I think that what happens is that a lot of times it's precisely commodification or monetization or what have you, which really problematizes the sharing of, or the appropriation of cultural elements, because then that really sort of takes the objectification to to the level where it's really a form of violence. Okay, because I guess that's the background. The concern is that when you culturally appropriate, you are implicitly objectifying the people from whom you are taking whatever it is that you're appropriating.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really what we want to avoid. We want to avoid objectifying.
Right. If you're a decent human being, you don't want to negate someone's existence.
Appreciate people in their full humanness. Is that what were your guys' thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that the sensitivity to the humanness of the other culture involved, the other people involved is what's important. I don't think that it's I don't think it's wrong for a chef to work with different cuisines from other cultures. What I think is wrong is to not be mindful of the culture from which you're working. It's not easy, to have these discussions and not appear like an oversensitive, brat or crybaby. But as we progress as a people, we want to be sensitive. I think that the neutral position of the human family is that of mutual aid and sensitivity. I honestly believe that, and I think as we move forward as a species, we have to be, we want to be sensitive. And we've been trained by the media to be cynical about these discussions. And so we get these comments like, well, is there anything I can say or do? Well, of course there is. And no one's saying you can't say or do this or that. But what we want to say is that we want to be sensitive and mindful of the other cultures. America has, I'm going to speak broadly here because obviously our guests and our people in the sidebar discussions probably wouldn't be included in this overarch. But I'm going to say that oftentimes people in America can be construed as not realizing that there are other people outside the borders. That's how often we're construed.
Very much so.
And so we want
myopic.
We want to try and be mindful that there are others outside our borders, and they do have cultures that have rich histories that might be worth us looking into, learning something about, appreciating and enjoying. Just like there are cultures within the United States, individual cultures within the United States that are worth looking into. The Appalachian culture is a wonderful, rich culture. And so, yes, we just need to be aware and sensitive to one another, not tiptoeing and walking around on eggshells or any of this stuff, but it's worth not making fun of. It's worth not making fun of people who are trying to have this discussion.
Hello, Tim.
Aloha, guys, and thank you for the discussion. It's actually extremely interesting. So just quickly, I would say that I think sometimes we try to paint Americans as these kind of like stupid people, that we don't, the statement that, well, we just don't know that other people are around. I think I think that Americans aren't so myopic that they don't understand.
We're often couched as that. I didn't say we're that way. I said we're often couched as that.
Okay, understood. And the one thing I would say to Thomas is that, so I guess it isn't to Thomas, I guess it's just a general statement, would be that I think we have to distinguish between when we can, and this was to do with the Muslim point, when we can criticize or mock an idea versus when we're going to criticize and mock a people. And I think we have to be very careful with that, because we could get to the point where people will use that against you when you're maybe criticizing their ideas, to switch it around and say, oh, no, you're not criticizing my ideas, you're criticizing the people, the group. So it could be a religious group or a minority or something like that. I think we have to be very careful, just because we want to be able to have free ideas back and forth and free speech, so that we can learn more about each other. And I think that if we do it the wrong way, we could get to the point where actually we're trying to be sensitive, but then we end up not creating the dialogue that we need to create. So those would be my points.
I would definitely go ahead. I'm sorry, Tom.
I'll hold my thought. Go ahead, Luke, and then I'll chime in.
I definitely think there's a distinction to be made as far as criticizing a person versus an idea. For example, I live, well, probably all of us, in my area, I live in a predominantly Christian culture. So it's one thing for me to say to a friend of mine who's a Christian, well, I think you're stupid. But it's another thing for me to say, this doctrine asserted in a particular book of the Old Testament, I think is backward and archaic and oppressive to people. You could shift that to the Quran and do the exact same thing without saying, I think you're a bad person, my Muslim friend or person that I just met. I don't agree with the tenets of Islam, or I don't agree with the assertions of Muhammad, or what have you. But I would even go beyond that to say there's a distinction to be made of me saying I think something is wrong versus I think that it should be shut down or prohibited. So I could disagree with Charlie Hebdo, but I'm not going to say they shouldn't be able to publish what they publish. Just like I don't agree with the Ku Klux Klan, but should they be able to print their pamphlets on their own private printing presses? I guess so. I'll shoot down their ideas, but I'm not going to say they need to be silenced, because if I start saying this group needs to be silenced, the cultural worm will eventually turn to the point where what I believe or hold to be true will come under fire. So along with your distinction, I would just add another distinction of saying via cultural appropriation. Like, I don't think that it's good to culturally appropriate, saying generally, but do I think any given person on the street should be able to wear pajamas? No, I'm not going to go rip their pajamas off of them, which I hadn't even thought of that before today, but it's just kind of a thing that came up. Or if I saw Victor walking down the street and he was wearing a dashiki, I'm not going to go strip him naked and smack him on the butt and say Victor, what the hell, man, go put on a kilt, or wherever you're going.
Nobody around would find that preferable. Let me assure you.
Anyway, forgive my jackassery, but in the conversation, I would not prohibit a person from doing something just because I don't like it. But I think that your point is extremely valid and true in this day and age where it's very easy to silence a person just by calling them a bigot. If you don't like my ideology, you're a bigot. Well, that's not necessarily. I mean, it could be true, but it's not necessarily true.
Right. The point is well taken.
I would. I don't really have any sort of like sharp disagreement with anything that you said, Tim, or I think Luke provided an adept sequel. The only thing I might add is that while it's very clear, like on the written page, the sort of these distinctions that we're making in logical form, when we come into the ground of like the real world or the concrete situation, it sometimes is problematic to just take refuge in that formality. Okay, so to work within the sort of Charlie Hebdo example, I'm not going to prohibit Charlie Hebdo from writing, or publishing what he published, or they published as a critique of certain elements of Islam, but at the same time, I can understand why people will receive that language as essentially violent and not necessarily moving a conversation forward in a meaningful way. I suppose that's what's the issue for me at the background is violence in general conversation, where you're actually moving outside of the universe in which rules of formal argumentative conduct are really almost negated, and it becomes this emotional back and forth. I think if you want to have the benefit of truly logical exchange, you have to be very careful about how you use humor, which I know that sounds like, oh God, it's so fuddy-duddy, right? Because if you just negate humor, well, the game is up. But at the same time, if you lack a certain discipline, then you're actually no longer being open. You're using the humor to kind of protect yourself from what's really at stake in the broader conversation. I'm going to leave it there because I feel like I'm almost rambling if I haven't rambled already. So.
Okay, well, thank you for all of your opinions. It was great to hear from you. And
I mean, if you want to say anything else, Tim, feel free.
No, I think those were it. That was basically it. All right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. So, and if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free. Though I should know we're coming up on an hour, so we might wrap it up for too much longer, just to keep it at least a recorded portion within certain bounds. So, hello, welcome back, Kristen.
Thanks.
So,
I love Timothy.
Kristen?
He's an awesome person, and I've really enjoyed watching him on Blab and blabbing with him. So I'm glad that you came in, Timothy. Thank you.
Right on. So,
anyone else want to join in? I can drop out again, but I'm here for now.
I'm trying to think. Go ahead, Luke. You were going to say something?
Oh, I was just in answering. I was going to ask all of you folks. So there's a question, Sam. It's gone up there. Anyway, it's faded back up, but it said so.
It's not harmful enough to warn
in
it.
Essence, but before that, it said something to the degree of, aren't you willing to defend your ideals? So I think that there's a big difference between me saying, I think that you're wrong, writing, an essay against it, speaking against it, even standing on a street corner and holding up signs saying, I think Thomas Lynn is wrong or whatever. And me saying, I wish the government would go and put Thomas Lynn in chains for what he says. So, there's kind of a big thing. Samuel, you'll have to help me out. Some of these questions just seem like sniping. They don't seem like really.
Yeah, so to read one of them here, so if cultural appropriation is harmful and you're not willing to shut down harmful things, what's the point? Is it not harmful enough? I mean, what do you mean by shutting down, Samil? I guess that would be my question.
Yeah, that would be a question. I don't think that everything's harmful should be illegal.
Well,
yes. But that doesn't mean that it should be condoned, right?
Well,
it's like if
course,
you have a conversation.
I think the goal is to be the goal is to be sensitive to what it is that's happening. I mean, the United States is the history's greatest imperial power, and it uses its imperial power in a whole lot of ways, and we, as people who live within this empire, need to sometimes be aware of what's happening outside its borders, and with the people that exist outside its borders, and then the people that get brought in to its borders. I don't think it's we teetered dangerously on the edge of discussion of free speech just a moment or two ago, and just to quickly add about talking about Charlie Hebdo and so on. If we aren't prepared to defend the most reprehensible kinds of speech, then we're not prepared to defend any speech at all. I understand how that implies or how that affects our conversation here about cultural appropriation because of the culture that Charlie Hebdo was referencing, the cultural aspect of the religious aspect that he was referencing. But I think that the application here, I mean, I understand it, but it's in a larger sense, it's a little slight. I don't know.
I did sort of compliment that. I want to say that what it really comes down to is personal responsibility. At least for me, I'm not having this conversation. I'm having this conversation in part to clarify what is this phenomenon, cultural appropriation, that has been pointed out by other people, but also to engender a greater sensitivity in terms of how conversations are conducted. I'm not calling for reliance on a legal apparatus to bring about certain changes in what is respected or what is subject to interdiction or taboo. Okay, and as soon as you start relying on the legal apparatus, as far as I'm personally concerned, you've already lost. Okay, because the legal the law, the rule of law, sir, it's, to put it generously, fundamentally conservative. It exists to preserve the status quo, and the status quo in which we find ourselves is one which is characterized by an absolutely horrendous degree of violence. And I don't just mean physical violence, I mean emotional violence, I mean spiritual violence, and that violence is getting in the way of people leading fulfilled lives as individuals and as communities. And cultural appropriation is one form of that violence. And I just saying, stop it. Stop being harmful. Stop being aggressive and using elements of other people's cultures against them so that they can, serve as, the butt of your joke, or so you can forget about the fact that you happened to, not you personally, Sunil, okay, but like one generally can forget, what has happened to bring us to where we are as a world. Okay, so that's why I'm standing essentially against cultural appropriation. That's what I'm concerned about in this conversation, speaking for myself.
Can I just address a question I just saw come across the I'm Morpheus just asked a question that we touched on briefly, but I'm Morpheus, if I could, I'd like to answer your question, at least from my perspective. I can answer the latter half of it more specifically and explicitly because I happen to be a professional chef, and I can tell you that yes and no. Is cooking food from other cultures cultural appropriation? Yes, it is, but it doesn't have to be in a harmful way. It could be a part of cultural sharing. It doesn't have to be necessarily appropriated. When a chef, this is what to me comes down to individual purpose, the intent. When a chef explores another cuisine, at least in my particular instance, it's done out of interest, and it's usually done with much study, and it's done with an appreciation for the ingredients and the time and history in which these dishes arrived, and how they were prepared. Personally speaking, whenever I delve into another culture's food, I'm not looking to get rich. I'm not looking to marginalize their culture or to negate it or to negate the history of the dish, just to experience it, to prepare it in a way that it was supposed to be prepared. And so I don't think that necessarily food from other cultures, cooking food from other cultures, it is necessarily appropriation. Can it be? Absolutely, it can be. And it can be done in an extremely disrespectful way. But now about Kung Fu, I'm a former practitioner of, let's say, Taekwondo years ago. And we touched on that when we discussed yoga a little bit. Yes, these things can be used in a way that's harmful. I think the bottom line there is intent, and when capitalism or monetization gets involved, then that's a discussion.
Yes, thank you. That, I think, seems to be the line, like as is with copyright laws and restrictions. When you profit upon another's back, then you should have some responsibility. And, you can choose to be a scumbag of this world, or you can choose to have some ethics. And that's why we're having this conversation, right? Because we want to talk about it so that we can make ethical decisions. So when Japan celebrates Christmas, is that cultural appropriation, and does it offend you? I don't see them profiting on that to spite. Who was it first that? Was it Sweden? I believe it was Sweden.
Well, Christmas, how we understand it now, is an amalgamation of, half a dozen different cultures.
Right.
Yeah, it's not an American product. It doesn't originate in America.
Talk about you and
graphic design and God, copyright and fair use.
Yeah.
Oh, who was that just said something about fair use?
That's my fiance,
Was
Bobby.
that Bobby? I'm learning so much about you today.
Hi. So
Bobby.
I took 4 years of graphic design in high school, and we learned about copyright and fair use, and how much of a big pain in the butt it is, really. How originally it started with, I think, like 14 or 15 years was as long as copyright lasted, because that's how long they believed that the people could profit from. They think that was enough time for people to make enough money and profit from, and then after that, it fell into the public domain, which is something anybody can use, and that's how a lot of stories and a lot of works of art usually blossom from works of other people, but not through profit or anything like that. It's usually from people just sharing in general. From what I'm understanding, at least of copyright, the original kind of escalade from it came from Disney, apparently, which was,
imagine that,
when Mickey Mouse was first invented. It had been like 13, 14 years, and when the copyright was first started. So he was about to fall into the public domain, so anybody could use them. And then Disney started to recruit lobbyists so that he could extend the time of copyright. And now it's like 70 years to a lifetime, and it can be renewed indefinitely. So like very few things still fall into the public domain, but we still have a little bit of a wiggle room there. And then there's another loophole that gets around copyright called fair use, which basically means you can use any amount of copyright as long as it's for educations or parodies or learning and teachings.
Yeah, parody. That's the one that cracks me up.
Yeah, but it's also very touchy because, I mean, there's a fine line between fair use and straight up plagiarizing. There's one of my favorite videos that talks about copyright. Uses a bunch of clips from Disney movies, and they explain in the very video that, like, they explain copyright and fair use and public domain. They use it by cutting and editing clips from Disney movies to make them say sentences that would explain how it works. And they even explained the reason they decided to do it this way is because Disney is such a large, incorporated, intimidating company that
they were thumbing their nose at Disney.
Basically, they were thumbing their nose at Disney. And this is how, that's how it gives a bit more power to the people.
Thank you so much. Like, that was an incredible contribution that you just made.
Oh, thank you. I'll leave you guys to it. Thanks.
Oh, well, I'll tell you what, we can keep talking beyond this, but I should probably pause the recording here since we've been going a little bit over an hour. So, and I realize that there's all these unresolved questions that we've been getting in the message column, for which I'm eminently grateful, and I'm sorry if we haven't been able to address them all adequately.
But it's great, right? I mean, we plan to keep going with this. I think it's a topic that it's not going to end tonight with our conversation. It's not going to end next week with our conversation. It's something that's ongoing. And so keep blasting your questions, and we'll keep thinking about them and researching and trying to do what we can.
So absolutely, and to Mike Oxard, this is not satire. I think that everyone involved in this conversation is quite
interested,
sincere. I just why don't we go around and they have maybe a concluding thought before we end the recording. We don't necessarily have to stop talking, but I'm going to end the recording in a moment. So why don't we go around? We'll go clockwise. I guess we'll start with you, Daniel, Kristen, Luke.
As usual, Tom, thanks for facilitating these discussions, and thank you for inviting me. I appreciate your indulgence, and I appreciate the invitation. These are topics that I haven't given a lot of thought to be quite honest with you. And as I began to think about them, I'll be 100% honest, I was irritated with the idea of thinking about them because I hadn't given any thought to the potential damage that they do. But as I thought about it and read and thought more about it, even coming into this discussion, it seems to me, and remembering things that my father had said, my father was had a great deal of Native American in him, and he was sensitive to some of these things, and it brought me to have a deeper understanding as to why he might have been sensitive about some of these things, particularly from the part of the country he came from. So thanks, Kristen, especially for giving me pause to think about these things. And I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. So thanks, everybody. And those of you who joined us and questioned, please keep your questions coming. I look forward to discussing this further at some future point. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I think as we're moving into this era of globalization, I think this is probably one of the most important conversations that we could have, just from the standpoint of we don't have all the answers. And so, yes, we do need to talk. There needs to be a forum. And I want to give a shout out to Blab because of this great place that we have to be able to talk to each other in this fashion and have the homepage where people can come in and just see, whatever they're topically interested in, and they can, jump in here. And appreciate everyone who has joined here today. Yeah, go global.
Thanks again, Tom, for having the forum in the first place. I think with topics like this, no matter how expanded one's mind and consciousness and experiences, we still have a limited view. And conversation is imperative to see how different ideas land on other people and resonate with other people to get perspectives and experiences that we haven't previously been exposed to, and of course, questions coming in. But not just on Blab, of course, this is great, but also as much as we can in day to day, and fostering from the ground up a community of people, a culture of people who are loving and sensitive to one another, so we don't have to have these top-down regulations imposing justice or imposing ethics on us. It's a natural from the ground up type exercise. So to Daniel's point, I don't have so many answers as it pertains to this topic specifically, but I'd like to keep fleshing through it, so some point in the future I do have more developed understanding of the topic at large, and especially from angles that I have not previously seen it myself.
What mode is it most interested in? Yeah.
So thanks for everyone given all your wisdoms.
Well, I really want to thank everyone as well. I really don't have anything a terrible moment to add at this junction, except to say that, really prior to 2 weeks ago, I hadn't thought very much about this category, cultural appropriation specifically, either. And it's remarkable how even turning your mind to it mildly can be disconcerting when it sort of exposes you, especially if you happen to benefit from being in a privileged segment of a population. It exposes you to just how much we need to do to move forward as a culture, so that we can have more civil conversation and in a more loving and embracing community. So thank you, and thank you also for those of you who have pushed back and asked challenging questions, because that's really integral to the process. We can just sort of sit around and agree with each other, and that's good fun. But at the end of the day, if we want to grow, then we have to engage those who may not see the world in the same light as we see it. So thanks for the pushback. So oh boy, Johnny, look at that. This guy asked. It depends on how the movie's about slavery, right, Johnny? Okay, he just asked that question there. But look, I'm gonna actually pause the recording. So close up sort of formally recorded portion of the conversation presently. We can still talk here for a few minutes. I might have to go relatively soon.